London in the late 1800s was a city of extremes. On one side, you had the grand mansions of the wealthy, men and women dressed in silks, attending the opera and dining on fine meals. But only a few miles away, deep in the East End, you would find a completely different world. This was Whitechapel, a district overflowing with poverty, filth, and desperation. Narrow alleys twisted through cramped neighborhoods, where entire families lived in single rooms, and many had no choice but to sleep in filthy lodging houses or on the street. The stench of unwashed bodies, horse manure, and rotting food hung in the air. Crime thrived in this place, from pickpockets to violent gangs, and for women, survival often meant turning to prostitution for a few pennies a night. It was here, in this environment of suffering, that one of history's most infamous killers would strike. His name would become legend, whispered in fear and written in bold headlines that sold newspapers across the world. But at the start, he was simply a faceless predator moving through the fog. No one could have imagined that the terror he brought would echo for more than a century. The year was 1888. Life in Whitechapel had always been hard, but now it was about to be shaken by a series of brutal murders. On the morning of August 31st, 1888, a woman named Marian Nichols, known as Polly to her friends, was found dead. Marian was 43 years old, with a life marked by hardship. She had once been married and had children, but alcohol and poverty had driven her into the streets. She often sought shelter in lodging houses, paying 4 pence for a night's bed when she could, or sleeping outside when she couldn't afford it. That night she had been turned out of a lodging house because she had no money. She promised she would earn some soon and return. Hours later, at about 3:40 in the morning, a carman named Charles Cross discovered her body on Bucks Row. At first he thought she was just a drunk woman lying in the street, but as he looked closer, he realized something was horribly wrong. Marian Nichols lay on her back, her skirt pulled up. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. When the police and doctor arrived, they discovered more horrors. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the abdomen. The ferocity of the attack stunned them. Whoever had done this was not just killing. He was mutilating. The discovery of Polly Nichols' body shocked the people of Whitechapel. Murders were not unheard of in the East End, but this was different. The sheer brutality of it felt almost inhuman. The police began their investigation, but the dark alleys of Whitechapel held many secrets. Witnesses were unreliable, and the streets were filled with thousands of people who might have passed by without noticing anything. Newspapers immediately seized on the story. They described the killing in gruesome detail, feeding the curiosity of readers across London. People were horrified, but they were also fascinated. Who could have done such a thing? The idea of a killer roaming the streets in the dead of night began to stir both fear and excitement. The police at first hoped it was an isolated act, perhaps the work of a jealous lover or a violent drunk. But just over a week later, their worst fears were confirmed. On September 8, 1888, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found murdered in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Annie was 47 years old, another woman living on the margins of society. She too struggled with poverty and alcoholism, and like Polly Nichols, she often earned her money by selling sex. That morning, residents of Hanbury Street woke to a gruesome scene. Annie's body lay near the back steps, her throat cut in the same savage manner as Polly's. But what horrified police even more was the mutilation. Her abdomen had been slashed open and organs removed. This was not a crime of passion or rage. It was something far darker. It seemed the killer had skill, perhaps even medical knowledge, because the cuts were precise, not random. Now the police were forced to face the truth. A serial killer was loose in Whitechapel. The East End, already a place of misery, was thrown into panic. Women who worked the streets feared for their lives, but desperation often forced them back out at night. Men looked over their shoulders as they walked home through the fog. Anyone could be next, and anyone could be the killer. The newspapers fed the hysteria. Sensational headlines screamed of the Whitechapel murders. Every gruesome detail was printed, every rumor repeated. The people of London demanded answers. Why couldn't the police protect the women of Whitechapel? Why was the killer always one step ahead? Scotland Yard brought in their best detectives, including Inspector Frederick Abeline, a man with years of experience in London's toughest districts. But even he would find the case maddening. As fear spread, theories began to form. Some said the killer must be a doctor or a butcher, someone skilled with a knife. Others believed he was an immigrant, feeding into the growing resentment toward the poor Jewish community in the East End. Angry mobs sometimes attacked innocent men in the streets, convinced they had caught the killer, but the real murderer remained hidden. By now, the press had begun to give him a name. Letters were arriving at police stations and newspapers, many claiming to be from the killer himself. Most were hoaxes, but one letter, signed Jack the Ripper, caught the public imagination. Whether or not it was genuine, the name stuck. The monster haunting Whitechapel now had an identity. He was no longer just an anonymous murderer. He was Jack the Ripper. The killings were not just crimes. They became a spectacle, a kind of dark theater played out in the foggy streets of London. Each murder drew crowds to the scene. People whispered rumors, shared their fears, and devoured the latest newspaper reports. For the poor of Whitechapel, the Ripper was both a terror and a grim reminder of how vulnerable they were. For the rich in the West End, he was a source of lurid fascination, a window into the violence of a world they rarely saw. The police were under enormous pressure. They increased patrols, interviewed witnesses, and chased leads, but nothing seemed to bring them closer to the killer. Whitechapel's maze of alleys and lodging houses provided endless hiding places, and the women who fell victim to the Ripper lived lives so precarious that they often vanished into the night without anyone noticing until it was too late. By the end of September, London had seen 2 murders that bore the same savage signature. But the terror was only beginning. Jack the Ripper was far from finished, and his most infamous crimes were still to come. The people of London had barely caught their breath from the murder of Annie Chapman when September bled into October, and the horror of Whitechapel reached new depths. The newspapers were filled with every rumor, every scrap of information about the faceless killer. People gathered on street corners, talking in hushed tones about the monster in their midst. Women were terrified, but poverty forced them to keep walking the streets at night, hoping to earn enough for a bed or a meal. The police promised that they were tightening their grip, but Jack the Ripper seemed to slip through their fingers like smoke. And then, on the night of September 30th, 1888, the city learned that his bloodlust had not yet been satisfied. It was just after midnight when Elizabeth Stride was seen alive for the last time. Liz, as her friends called her, was a 44-year-old woman originally from Sweden. Her life had been marked by hardship, broken relationships, and poverty, but she was known to be kind and gentle. That night she was on Berner Street, near a club used by local immigrants. At around 12:45 a.m., her body was discovered in a dark gateway. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the earlier victims, her body had not been mutilated. Some later suggested that the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his ritual. If so, what happened next would prove even more chilling. Less than an hour later, another body was discovered, this time in Mitre Square. Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, had spent much of her life drifting between lodging houses and casual work. She was last seen leaving a police station after being arrested for drunkenness earlier that night. At about 1:45 a.m., her body was found in the square. Her throat had been cut, and her abdomen ripped open with savage precision. Parts of her organs had been removed, and her face had been slashed in a grotesque manner. The brutality shocked even hardened police officers. For the first time, 2 murders had occurred in the same night, within walking distance of each other. This would come to be known as the double event, and it cemented Jack the Ripper's reputation as a figure of unimaginable cruelty. Panic spread like wildfire. The people of Whitechapel were now convinced that the killer could strike anywhere, at any time, and that no one was safe. Crowds filled the streets after the murders, some gathering near the crime scenes to gawk, others to protest against the police. Fear mixed with fury as people demanded to know why the authorities had failed to protect the city. Scotland Yard was under immense pressure, but with each murder, their failure became more obvious. As the investigation deepened, the police began to receive letters claiming to be from the killer himself. Most were dismissed as hoaxes, but one in particular would become infamous. It was addressed to Dear Boss and written in red ink. The letter mocked the police and promised more killings. It was signed with a name that would enter history, Jack the Ripper. Whether or not the letter was genuine, it gave the faceless killer an identity that captured the imagination of the press and the public. Soon, every newspaper headline screamed a name, and Jack the Ripper became a legend as well as a terror. Another letter arrived shortly after, accompanied by half of a preserved human kidney. The writer claimed to have taken it from one of his victims. This gruesome package, known as the From Hell letter, left many convinced that it truly came from the killer. Doctors examined the kidney and confirmed that it was human, though whether it really belonged to Catherine Eddowes, who had been found with organs missing, was never proven. Still, the message was clear. Jack the Ripper was taunting the world, feeding the fear that already consumed the city. For the people of Whitechapel, the murders became part of their daily lives. Women whispered warnings to one another, telling friends to stay away from certain streets or not to walk alone. Men with foreign accents or unusual behavior were accused, sometimes attacked by angry mobs convinced they had found the killer. Police patrolled more heavily, but the East End was a labyrinth of alleys and shadows. Jack the Ripper moved through it unseen, blending into the thousands of men who roamed the streets at night. Scotland Yard brought in more detectives, among them Inspector Frederick Abeline, who became one of the lead investigators. Abeline was experienced and determined, but he was faced with an impossible task. The forensics of the time were primitive. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no modern investigator tools. Witness accounts were contradictory and unreliable. Some claimed to have seen a man with one of the victims shortly before her death, but the descriptions varied wildly. He was tall, short, dark-haired, fair-haired, well-dressed, shabby. In the chaos of Whitechapel, almost any man could fit the description. Despite their efforts, the police were always one step behind. Jack the Ripper seemed to strike at will, vanishing into the night before anyone could stop him. Each new murder added to his legend, and the press made sure his name was never out of the headlines. The public's fascination was morbid, but unrelenting. People wanted every detail, no matter how gruesome. The newspapers fed them, describing the mutilations in vivid language, ensuring that readers were both horrified and addicted. By October of 1888, London was gripped by fear. The city's darkest corners had become the stage for a killer who seemed unstoppable. The police were mocked in the press for their failure, and politicians were pressured to act. The rich looked on with a mixture of horror and fascination, while the poor lived with the constant dread that the Ripper could be lurking just around the corner. And then, on November 9th, the terror reached its peak. A young woman named Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered in her small room on Dorset Street. Her killing would prove to be the most savage of all, and it would also mark the end of Jack the Ripper's known crimes. But before her story can be told, we must look closely at how the fear of the Ripper had transformed not only Whitechapel, but the entire city of London. By November of 1888, London was exhausted. The murders had continued for months, each one crueler than the last, each one exposing the inability of the police to stop the killer. People were weary from fear, yet still glued to every headline, every whisper of news about Jack the Ripper. The East End was drowning in suspicion. Men were questioned and released, mobs still threatened strangers in the street, and women walked with their eyes darting into the shadows. The name Jack the Ripper had become a ghost that haunted the city, but the real one was still out there. And then, on the morning of November 9th, his cruelty reached its most horrifying climax. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the Ripper's earlier victims. She was only 25 years old, much younger than the others, and though she lived in poverty, those who knew her said she was lively, beautiful, and full of spirit. She was Irish by birth and had once lived with a man in better circumstances, but like so many women in Whitechapel, she had drifted into hardship and prostitution. She rented a tiny room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, known as one of the worst slums in London. Unlike the other victims who had been attacked in the open streets, Mary Jane Kelly had a small room to herself. It should have offered safety, but instead, it became the setting for the Ripper's most savage work. At around 10:45 that morning, her landlord's assistant came to collect overdue rent. When he knocked and got no answer, he peered through the window. What he saw made him stagger back in horror. Inside the small, dimly lit room lay Mary Jane Kelly, or what remained of her. Her body had been mutilated in ways even the most hardened police had never witnessed. When investigators arrived, the scene was almost beyond comprehension. Her throat was cut, her abdomen and chest opened, and organs removed and placed around the room. Her face was so badly mutilated that she was almost unrecognizable. The brutality went far beyond what had been done to the earlier victims, as if the killer, alone in the privacy of her room, had taken his time unleashing the full depth of his violence. News of the murder spread like fire, and crowds gathered outside Miller's Court, desperate for details. Police officers tried to push them back, but people strained for a glimpse of the crime scene, whispering about the horrors inside. For many, this was the ultimate confirmation that Jack the Ripper was not just a killer, but a monster. The police, already humiliated by their inability to catch him, now faced the fact that even after months of hunting, he had struck again right under their noses. But after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, something strange happened. The killing stopped. Despite the fear that he would strike again, no more bodies bearing the signature of Jack the Ripper were ever found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the corpses of his victims and the terror he had sown. The police, of course, did not stop searching. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, combed through Whitechapel again and again, and followed every lead. But they found nothing that could identify the killer with certainty. Over the years, many names have been put forward as possible suspects. Some pointed to Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who drowned himself in the Thames shortly after the last murder. Others suspected Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who was later committed to an asylum. There was also Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor with a criminal past, and George Chapman, a barber who later poisoned 3 of his wives. Each man seemed suspicious in some way, but none could be definitively proven to be Jack the Ripper. Even today, more than a century later, theories abound. Some believe the Ripper was a doctor or surgeon, pointing to precision of the mutilations. Others argue he was a butcher, used to cutting flesh. Some think he may have been a local man who knew the alleys of Whitechapel well, able to slip away before the police arrived. Still others whisper darker theories that he was someone with influence or power, protected from the law, or perhaps even part of the establishment itself. What is certain is that the police of 1888 were simply not equipped to catch him. They had no fingerprints, no forensic science, no way to match evidence with a suspect. They relied on witness descriptions, and those were confused and contradictory. The streets of Whitechapel were crowded and chaotic, making it almost impossible to track a killer who knew how to vanish into the fog. The investigation was further hindered by the sheer pressure of public scrutiny. Every failure was magnified in the press, every rumor treated as fact, every mistake exposed to ridicule. And yet, the legend of Jack the Ripper grew precisely because he was never caught. He became not just a man, but a symbol of fear, of violence, of the darkness that can hide in any city. His name entered history books, novels, plays, and eventually films. He became the archetype of the unknown killer, the shadow in the alley, the figure you can never quite see but always feel behind you. For the people of Whitechapel in 1888, he was not a legend but a daily terror. Women kept glancing behind them as they walked, clutching their shawls tighter. Men eyed their neighbors with suspicion, wondering if the killer was someone they knew. Families huddled together at night, listening for sounds in the dark. And for the victims, Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, Jack the Ripper was the monster who cut their lives short and left their names forever bound to his. Today, historians and criminologists still study the case. Some claim to have new evidence, even DNA hints, though nothing has been confirmed beyond doubt. The truth is that Jack the Ripper's identity may never be known. Perhaps he was one of the named suspects. Perhaps he was someone forgotten by history, a man who slipped back into obscurity after his crimes. Perhaps he died, was imprisoned for another crime, or simply stopped killing. What remains is a mystery, and the haunting knowledge that a man could commit such brutal acts and then disappear, leaving nothing but questions behind. And so, more than a century later, Jack the Ripper remains what he was in 1888, a ghost in the fog, a shadow on the cobblestones, a monster London never caught. His name still sends a chill through the imagination, and his crimes are still studied, retold, and remembered. Perhaps that is his final legacy, not just the murders, but the way he forced a city and later the world to confront the darkest depths of human cruelty. Even now, people wonder, was Jack the Ripper an ordinary man walking home through crowd, his face unnoticed, his knife hidden beneath his coat? Or was he someone more, a figure with influence, protected from the consequences of his actions? We may never know. But the mystery remains, as chilling today as it was in the foggy streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888.